Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea Podcast retrospective on The National, one of indie rock's biggest acts. And this week, we're here to talk about their album from 2017. We're going to be talking about Sleep Well Beast. Last time, we talked about Trouble Will Find Me and how that was sort of a commercial epitome for the band. It was sort of them playing into their success as an act, as a sort of cultural force. And now we have Sleep Well Beast. Ryley, is there anything notable about the lead up to Sleep Well Beast that we might want to mention to preface with?
Well, is there anything notable? I mean, it's the National, for Christ's sake. I mean, we're gonna try and continue as we've done so far in this series. One of my favorite things about doing series like this is that it's kind of like a narrative that we're telling, where each episode is kind of continuing the story as much as it is talking about, the next album, yada, yada, yada. And, to keep it personal as well, we've had guests on for previous episodes, but maybe befitting the fact that this is a much more sort of intimate and even withdrawn album in some ways. It's just the two of us today, and I think you'll see in due time why the two of us is actually plenty to talk about this album, because we both have very strong feelings about it and connections to it. I'll say, as the long-time National fan, I mean, if you listen to our Trouble Will Find Me episode, I said in there that around the time that album came out was around the time I got fully into the National. I mean, just before that, anyway, that was the first album I was there for on the ground floor. And Sleep Well Beast, to be clear, Trouble Will Find Me came out just after I had turned 16. Sleep Well Beast came out after I had turned 20. So it's a gap of 4 years,
God.
which is already, generally speaking, a lot for most, reasonably well-to-do bands. But also, within the context of my life, it wasn't just 4 years. It was like a fifth of my entire life up until that point passed between the release of Trouble
You're
Will Find Me.
essentially a different person on the release of that
And it
album.
felt like it too. It felt like I had been waiting for fucking ever for the National's next album. I mean, in the interim, we did have in 2014, Matt Berninger teamed up with Brent Knopf from the great indie rock band Menomina and released the side project Alvi. They put out an album called Return to the Moon, a really fun sort of let your hair down, sort of eclectic, sort of Talking Heads-esque take on the National, a bit more sort of rhythmically focused, and a really fun side project that I really recommend checking out if you haven't already, which I think that was 2015, not 2014, but either way, that's a really, really underrated record that I definitely used to take up some of that time while I was waiting for a more National. I listened to that album a lot the year it came out. And yeah, so it was just waiting with bated breath to see, what the hell would happen next. Of course, in 2016, as we've talked about on this podcast a long time ago, but Aaron Dessner from the National produced what would turn out to be the final Frightened Rabbit album, Painting of a Panic Attack as well, which in a number of ways, this won't surprise anyone who's familiar with that album and who might have heard our discussion of it, that album definitely filled a National-sized hole in me for a little while, because it really was it was a slice of brutally sad indie rock that was what I wanted from the National, but what I wasn't getting because they were taking their sweet ass time. Obviously touring Trouble Will Find Me, but also, side projects taking their time. And I think this gap is emblematic of one quite important thing, which is that the National at this point had officially crossed the gap into the late career era. All right, so we kind of talked about this a little bit with Trouble Will Find Me, where it was like the first or even the second, maybe depending on how you want to argue it, album after the masterpiece that had kind of defined and represented their critical and commercial peak, right? But so the Trouble Will Find Me was in many ways a kind of final album in that sort of golden patriarchal era of the band. But what's interesting is that even as the National, in terms of critical circles, were kind of making that passage into sort of a late career era, commercially, they were still kind of ascendant. They were still crossing through to mainstream audiences more and more. than they had even been around the time of, Boxer and High Violet, for instance. Like those were big indie albums. But around the time of Trouble Will Find Me, but much more so with this album, the National were starting to make kind of commercial imprints. And, they were still definitely an indie rock band. They were still like mainly appealing to a particularly, narrow demographic, and they weren't crossing over into, Billboard Hot 100 territory or anything like that.
No.
But they were, I think, becoming a little bit more of a wider known name, kind of like a classic rock band that's sort of starting to have a bit of an audience outside of the original niche that they occupied.
I
And
think you
this
can
is
chalk that down to honestly the ubiquitousness of streaming. It's because bands like this in the 2010s, if they were able to carry their success from the kind of pre iTunes pre-streaming era and they were able to go forward, their success kind of plateaued. And bands like The National, who had this like follower base, they might not they might not get into the Billboard Top 100 or anything, but it allows bands of this size to stay bands of this size and kind of continue being themselves, because people can more, it's just easier to access their music and more affordable to access their music. And so I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that it just sort of happened to coincide with this big movement in the music industry that ended up being really advantageous for a group of bands that maybe we wouldn't have predicted it be advantageous for.
Yeah, and it certainly helped the National is, they're a fairly inoffensive and uncontroversial band. Like they're not necessarily a band that's going to split audiences, although some people are pretty adamant that they're one of the most boring bands of all time. But and you can kind of understand that if people aren't sort of into the general sort of rock template that the National are working within. But the other thing that I think that's neatly representative of the way that the National were still kind of ascendant in this era was that Sleep Well Beast won them the Grammy Award for Best Alternative Music Album in 2018, which is kind of like if you win the Grammy for Best Alternative Music Album, that's essentially a coronation into the field of like usually by the time you win that, you've been around for at least a decade and you've kind of shown a level of perseverance and an ability to kind of stay relevant and stay interesting to the point
it
where
means
suddenly
something when you win the same award as Tom Waits.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're usually, if you're winning the Grammy for Best Alternative Music Album, you've been grinding for so long that you're also, higher up on festival lineups and maybe even headlining some of things like Pitchfork Festival or whatever. You're actually starting to make an impact outside of the niche that you began inside of. And of course, as well, the other thing that would have helped the National to continue to achieve commercial success in this era is that the wave of various sort of indie rock and even bands outside of indie rock that the National clearly inspired are starting to have their own levels of crossover success as well. And this is something that we'll talk about a little bit more maybe in the final episode of this series, where you start to see the National's influence ballooning into the world of popular music. And this is something where the extent to which it affects the National themselves, we might not know until their next album. But it's a continuing narrative of the National's ascendance and of the presence of artists like Matt Berninger, but particularly of Bryce and Aaron Dessner as well behind the scenes in the wider world of music that is showing essentially how this band are continuing to balloon, essentially. But that's enough of the meta stuff. I mean, let's talk about the album itself. So Sleep Well Beast, after a 4-year wait, finally arrived in 2017. And again, because I lived through this, I have to emphasize that it was really drawn out. Okay, so the album was released in September of 2017, but it was announced in May of that year. So there was a 4-month wait, I think 4 or 5 months it was, between the announcement of the album, the release of the lead single, which is The System Only Dreams in Total Darkness, and then the album itself. And I can tell you, if the 4 years in between these two National albums felt like an eternity, the 4 months between the announcement of Sleep Well Beast and the album itself, for me, was like 4 lifetimes. I was just aching for this album. I remember like they were playing songs at live shows, and I was watching like shitty phone recorded bootlegs of songs, and I even had like an assembled, live recordings thing that had the whole track list of the as yet unreleased album in live recording form, because I was that fucking obsessed.
You were just jonesing.
I was just like, yeah, and I did. It's funny, I did this for I'm Easy to Find as well. But yeah, Sleep Well Beast was an album that felt like, it was so long in the making that it had so much to live up to. And it's strange because when The System Only Dreams in Total Darkness dropped, and I mean, hey, we can talk about the song first if you want. I mean, it's the lead single. It's kind of the most sort of I guess in your face track on the album. It's definitely this album's equivalent of like Sea of Love, for instance. It's a song that immediately you're greeted with those sort of eerie nocturnal choral vocals,
yeah,
that end up just kind of transitioning seamlessly into this, more traditional bass line of indie rock sound. But you also have this really kind of, I don't know what effects that Aaron or Bryce is using on the guitars that gives it that sound. It sounds really like kind of electrified and all that sort of thing. But otherwise, I mean, the song is more or less what you would expect from the National. I mean, while the album that it accompanies is much moodier and more nocturnal than any of their previous releases, what's really interesting to me, especially listening back right after talking about Trouble Will Find Me, is how fulsome, muscular, and kind of heavy this song is if you compare it to the sound palette of Trouble Will Find Me. Like, this is just, there's a lot of weight here. It's just a much louder and more fulsome song than anything on that record. What do you think of this sort of track, especially as a kind of like taster of this album?
At first, I was like, when I learned that this was the single they released, I was just kind of like, really? This one? Like, I mean, on one level, I kind of get it, because yeah, it is kind of a, like, comparatively speaking, it's a bit more immediate than some of the other tracks on here. And then I just kind of looked through the track list of this album and was just sort of like, there's not really an easy single choice here, so I can't really say I blame the band. But I think that the sort of the production here is definitely notable, just because it really does feel like that when they sort of reached their sort of peak cultural saturation on Trouble Will Find Me, where they have a lot of points where their sound is very low key and muted. And that can have its limitations with people, but I think that, generally speaking, that's sort of for the album's benefit. Just that's the kind of album that it is. But it also sort of plays into a sort of what people expect from the National and what kind of music they would be willing to receive with open arms. And that very much fits into that sort of pre-established idea. Whereas I think Sleep Well Beast is a bit of a creative spark at this point in their career, after they, played it safe with their last album, I guess to say it in so many words. But this album feels like, at this point anyway, the Nationals' experimental album. There is certainly moments of this that feel like they fit well within the confines of like the post-punk revival and what have you, but there's elements of weird glitchy indie-tronica on here and chamber pop, and it's just, this album in general is so full of dynamism in a way that their sound really hasn't been since like Alligator, probably, in that it mixes a lot of like gnarled, kind of uglier electronic sounds and a lot of, more fulsome sounding organic instrumentals. And it feels disarming at first when you listen to it on songs like this, because they have those ideas like that weird guitar that feels like, it feels like stilted in the system only dreams in total darkness. It feels like something is wrong, not only with the way it sounds, but the way it's being played. And you're just kind of like, this is very strange, because like the melody in the song is very insistent and very full of momentum. And so when you're introduced to these ideas, they feel very strange at first, but once they sort of fit neatly, once you sort of see the vision with this album, it means that these songs are just packed to the brim with so much detail in a way that this band has never really been before, or I mean, since it's kind of a relatively recent album. But it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of the ideas that they revisit here they visit here sonically are not revisited again, just because it feels so linked to this moment in time. But it's something that I really find super compelling about the album. It makes revisiting all of these tracks really compelling, because you can notice all these little tiny ideas and interesting little things. And it also leads to moments where, again, this is going to really leap out at you, like the guitar solo kind of that opens the sort of final third of the song, which again sounds supremely fucked in a way that even the other guitars on the first part don't quite sound. It sounds so distorted, but also like it's taking place elsewhere to the other instrumentation in the song. It's very, very odd, but
it's also like incredibly sick soloing. It has to be said, in a way that like is such a like a
classic
complete
rock
left turn from the band. Yeah, it is. It's like a classic rock solo, but it's kind of filtered through this incredibly processed effects pedal that makes it sound like, you know, like a really sort of synthetic tone, essentially.
And it clashes with that sort of insistent piano melody in a way that feels like, you know, at first super disruptive, but then the interplay between the two is just kind of unexpectedly beautiful, so that when the guitar subsides and then it comes back for a moment, you just sort of take a moment to appreciate how centrally beautiful it is right before Matt comes back in. And then the final bit of this song just sends me to the moon when Matt's sort of like yelling the vocals of the chorus, where he's like, I can't explain it any other way. Other way. And it's like this is just one of the most national songs now for me.
Yeah. It's a great gateway into this record, I think, because it presents and sets up a lot of ideas that the album delves into in a very abstracted form. And so I want to talk about now the concept. And I will say already, like Matt's been very clear, this isn't a concept album, but this is in a lot of ways, and I think in a way that's the reason why I like this record more than Trouble Will Find Me, is that I feel like it itself has a little bit more of a within itself, it has a little bit more of a consistent and fascinating individual identity. And some of the ideas that it flirts with and the relationship between those ideas that come through in Matt's very abstract lyricism and through the sound palette of the record are really fascinating. So essentially, Sleep Well Beast is kind of an album about the blurred lines between the personal and the political to a certain extent, or it is about living in the mid 2010s and the ways in which personal relationships and the political consciousness of the world around you and your own consciousness of the way the world is operating, how those two things start to become inextricably linked and interactive with each other. And so you have this album that is, on the one hand, kind of a portrait of a disintegrating marriage that, you know, and Matt and Corinne, who are still writing here together as they always have, are, you know, they're communicating and they're writing songs that are very much about sort of a distance and intimacy and trying to bridge that gap. But also you have this album that is about kind of like how political systems that dictate and kind of create the world that you live in essentially get to shape your relationships and get to kind of, and the way that the kind of ever-present cloud of politics kind of just seeps into elements of your life. And there is like, there's to some extent you could read it straightforward as just an album about, you know, marriage, and an album about how the relationship between, you know, you and your partner changes after you've been married for a really, really long time, how you navigate that shift into a kind of later stage of life and of your marriage together, and kind of just the political stuff just sort of being an ambient background that's kind of just seeping into the day-to-day ways in which you deal with and navigate that relationship, but also as well you can read the relationship narrative as a kind of almost metaphorical analog for the way that we reckon with our relationship to the world that we're living in, essentially, like the kind of abusive relationship between politics and the people, between governance and the people that are governed, between systems. There's themes of like, you know, surveillance and the kind of sort of hyper, almost Philip K. Dick-esque nightmarish technological dystopia that we're kind of situated in, that doesn't feel like a technological dystopia because it doesn't feel like a piece of science fiction. It's such a normalized sort of state of living. There's lots of these sorts of fascinating themes of personal distance and personal, you know, difficulties within relationships, and also kind of the alienating nature of the, you know, systems that we live in as well. And these two broad themes interact with each other, and they provide both a coherent interrelating interpretation of the album, but also two separate interpretations of it as well. And okay, I'm getting real into my English student, you know, national interpretation thing here, but I do think that is the framework that the album is kind of built upon, and it's something that I think makes every single song on this record open to various different interpretations that make them really fascinating as works of songcraft, as reflections of Matt's continually evolving persona as a songwriter, as an artist, and as the Nationals, you know, identity as an American sort of Midwestern band, essentially, that are kind of very much commenting on and crafting a picture of life in an evolving landscape, essentially, as much as they did in records like Alligator and Boxer as well, but very much, you know, in a setting that is, because those records are so like painfully Bush years albums, and this record here is like a painfully post-Obama record, and a kind of record about the political consciousness and insanity that essentially all of America was forced to confront, and then the rest of the world by virtue of that in 2015 and 2016, when suddenly the world of politics became impossible to ignore on any level. And started to reflect the insanity of the technologically rapidly advancing hellscape that we were already dancing towards. And this is essentially an album where all of that, if it's not, you know, directly explicitly about those things, they are inarguably woven into the fabric of it, right down to the fact that The System Only Dreams in Total Darkness, I mean, the song itself has overt sort of political overtones with that title, but also the lyrics, by contrast, they're intimate, and they kind of talk about and reference a disconnect in communication, presumably between two people, but equally you could read between one individual person and their understanding of the people that govern them, essentially their ability to relate to them, the perceived deceit, the perceived falseness of the system that they live in. And it ends up being a really fascinating record emotionally because of that.
One thing you mentioned is that this is a very post-Obama administration album, and I think like that's important to emphasize, that it is very that, but it's also not like, it's a very post-Obama album, but it's not necessarily a, you know, Trump's America album necessarily. Is that it feels like it's very much focused on the systemic societal ills that sort of persist in a world that's sort of mired in a sense of contemporary complacency. And so I feel like, you know, if you're worried necessarily that the political themes might feel a bit too you know, insistent, I guess, that doesn't really happen on here. And I feel like their flexibility that Ryley spoke about is very much also you know, speaks to this album's strength from a writing perspective, is that they're kind of inextricably related to one another. And I think that the through line between the two of them is that's like really well maintained, is the overriding theme of this album, which to me anyway is helplessness. This is an album about being stuck in the world you live in and with this relationship, with this partner, to the point where you've just sort of accepted the fact that this is the way that it's going to be, regardless of like whether or not it's good for me, whether or not it's good for the other person, whether or not it's good for the world. It is just resignation, and it is sort of an overview of what led them to this point. There's like it sort of peels back on the opener to the point where you sort of see the kind of inception of this relationship, and then it sort of kind of tears it down and sort of deconstructs it throughout the album as a whole. So it does really revisit those ideas that were on Alligator and Boxer of sort of like living in that sort of contemporary Midwestern American, slightly upper class sort of relationship kind of thing. But I feel like the more comprehensive and more the sort of level up that they've taken since in writing into the more internal, introspective, and personal lands this a sort of depth and clarity that I personally get along with a whole lot more. And it sort of peers away from the more overtly satirical and just goes kind of straight for the jugular a lot of the times with the sort of emotional approach, which I think is the best way to lead into the opener, which is Nobody Else Will Be There. And this is my favorite song by The National. Those who have been with us a while, you will, if you've been a viewer for a very long time, can sort of chart my relationship with this record over the course of like 4 different what we've been listening to segments, where each time I incrementally just sort of say like, I really think this album's going to keep growing on me. I think one day I think this is going to be one of my favorite National albums, until one day late last October it became my favorite. And I think that the sort of key to unlocking it sort of lies with Nobody Else Will Be There, which is just an immortal song. This is a song, it is by far my most played National song. Throughout this last year alone, I have listened to it enough times to get it to that spot. But every single tiny idea in this song, I am utterly in love with. Like it's like almost deathly quiet at the beginning. There's like basically nothing but white noise, and then you hear this sort of like skittering percussion that leads into the main piano melody. And there's not any like complicated reason as to why this is my favorite National song, other than it makes me feel a lot of feelings. But it lies in the simplicity of this piano melody, which is, it's otherworldly. Like it's not complicated, it's not compositionally super dense or whatever, but just the bum 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 bum.
It's
bum,
like
bum, bum.
maybe no one in the world has more talent for just crafting these impeccably, immediately classic sounding piano melodies than, I think it's Aaron, but forgive me if I'm wrong, whoever does compose these basic melodies. They're just always incredible. And I mean, you get them on every single album, including the next album as well. But the little that piano motif that comes through in Nobody Else Will Be There is one of the most like definitely like just perfect musical ideas that the National craft on this entire record. And the way that, okay, so this is an interesting opening track because it's by far the quietest opening song on any National album. And it's, so in that sense, it's an unusual way to open a record for this band. And it really does, in a lot of senses, set up what you can expect from the rest of the record, which is in a lot of ways the band zagging where you might expect them to zig. The band also setting up this relationship between the synthetic and the kind of warm, organic tones as well. I mean, you have that it's not actually a synthetic tone, I don't think, but it sounds like someone kind of slapping wood or something, or like rapping their knuckles on wood, that little bit of percussive feedback that's happening, that's kind of giving this song a little like a metronomic quality. And then the piano comes in. And what I remember distinctly about hearing this for the first time is that, because again, I had consumed every song on this record in its live form. And in the live forms, like everything came through with such sharpness and like such just vivid clarity, right? That it was like I was expecting an album that was going to sound like lightning, essentially. But this is just because that's how the National make their songs sound when they play live. But when you listen to this, the production style, again, this record is self-produced for the most part, with some additional mixing by Peter Cadis, but it is mostly self-produced by Aaron and Bryce. This has a really muted tone to it. And where other bands or bands who are, I guess, more inclined to just make things sound as bright and just vivid as possible would make it sound really sort of colorful and just impactful, everything has this quality of almost like deathly quietude. Like and this song is like really emblematic of that. Everything feels so muted. Matt's delivery is like somewhere between singing and whispering, almost like he is just barely even raising his voice to any point. Like even when he does that part on the chorus, where he's like, "Can we just go home?" Like that's as emotive as he really gets, and even then, it feels like it's so restrained. And in the terms of the setting of the song as well, like begging your partner essentially, "Can we get the fuck out of here?" Being in this place that you're not comfortable being in, this environment, this party or whatever. I mean, it's a theme that feels like, this is a sort of song that the National have written before. I mean, in a lot of ways, lyrically, I'm reminded a little bit of Slow Show, which has that same sort of idea of kind of being in this sort of social environment and stuff, being unable to think of anyone else but the person that you're with or the person that you want, essentially, and wanting nothing more than to just get out of there and just embrace the fantasy with that person. Whereas here it's like it has this sort of devastating twist in the sense that you've been with this person forever now, and so the simple desire just to get out with them is no longer this kind of pleasant sort of romantic sort of thing where it's like, I only want to be with you, let's get away from this. It's like almost tearing them apart. This idea of like, I just want to get out of here, I want to be somewhere else where we can be together with no one else around. And that doesn't have like an intimate quality to it. It doesn't have like a kind of idealistic solitude with your partner quality to it. It has this idea of like, we're in a state now where we can't let other people see us like this. And that's what really kind of twists the knife to a certain extent. And again, to relate it back to that other sort of socio-political element of the record as well, it is this idea, of like existing in a world and in America of a hyper saturated sort of landscape where essentially it's harder than ever to be truly alone. And so you start to idolize, fetishize, even become desperately attached to the idea of isolation, essentially. And so those two readings of this song, I think, both feed into the sheer despairing urgency, but also like defeatedness of the way he sings "Nobody Else Will Be There," which is just that really is my favorite part of the whole song, is the way that line lands each time he says it. It almost has a different context each time he says it. Like the first time it comes in, after this, it's kind of like dream of escape, essentially, meet me in the stairwell for a glass of gin, nobody else will be there then. It sounds kind of pleasant. It sounds like an escape then, in a way that you would be wanting to leap towards, to kind of be with someone and just share in your introverted, antisocial way of being. And then the second time that line comes in, after like in this weird depiction of Matt just desperately trying to remember the building that this person lives in, it's freezing, he's just kind of enraptured by the landscape and this weird stasis that he's existing in. It feels different than when he says "nobody else will be there." And then finally, in that bridge going into the final verse, it's like, there's no romanticism, there's no idealism. It's just, we look like children. We are standing here, people are gawking at us. We don't know how to leave. Goodbyes always take us half an hour, which is just one of my favorite little lines in the song because it's so like relatable. and this idea of like feeling like even though you two are unified, and this idea of wanting to get out of this awkward social scene where you just can't bear to be there any longer, but you also don't know how to socially navigate out of it. You feel isolated all the same from this person you're with. Where were you back there when I needed your help? I thought if I stuck my neck out, I'd get you out of your shell. My faith is sick and my skin is thin as ever. Like, that's such a broken, just haunted line. And so by the end of the song, any sense of, yeah, again, as I say, any sense of romanticism or any sense of like freedom and escape is gone, essentially. It's just this desperate pleading, essentially, for a moment where you don't have to think about anyone else but yourselves. So yeah, it's a fucking brutal song. And I think it kind of relates to, I'm going to be a little bit non-linear with this album track list, I guess, because it kind of relates to another song that I want to talk about, which is actually the second single that was released for this album. And I think also has a very similar lyrical approach, theme, way of dealing with this, intimate distancing theme, which is the song Guilty Party from the second half of this record. And this song is, I think, like super right. And again, it's almost like it's a thematic extension of Nobody Else Will Be There. And musically, there's a lot more going on in it. But essentially, it's the same idea, essentially, of this isolation from and distancing from this once close figure in your life, whether that figure is your literal partner or whether that figure is like the world that you live in. Sleeping night and day, how do you do it? I'm wide awake, feeling defeated. Yeah, and this song, like, it introduces, or it kind of brings back certain musical ideas that we've had throughout the album, of like these sort of skittering drum machine sounds, weird snatches of like broken electronic synthesizers and guitar tones, all of that sort of mingling and melding with the basic whining guitars and piano and bass that we're typically used to from all of these songs. You have, of course, we haven't even talked about Brian Devendorf, the amazing drummer, who is still bringing his style on this record. I would almost describe as militaristic. He almost plays like industrially in a certain sense on this record, because a lot of the rhythms that he plays are very static and repetitive and kind of like almost post-punky in a weird, strange way. But yeah, this song kind of brings all that together, and it sort of continues exploring that theme of how you kind of try to reconcile, or at the very least understand, this emptiness that's inside where once an intimacy and a closeness once used to be. And ultimately it just devolves into just that repeated refrain of, it all catches up to me, it all catches up to me all the time. Like this inability to process, this complete overload, essentially, of stimulation that just leaves you broken down and almost like malfunctioning. Like that kind of, that persistent electronics of this record and the weird synthetic sounds, like almost feel like they're a great way of musically communicating the sheer noise of the world, essentially, like all of the electronic humming, essentially. And this is a musical idea that Radiohead are very fond of as well, and a lot of their most cluttered productions as well. It's very much the OK Computer technique, or at least just put a whole bunch of like weird sort of broken, fractured electronic sounds all over these mixes to kind of make it feel like this whole like landscape of just technological trauma, essentially, is constantly hanging over you. But it also, on this record, feels like these little electronic squelches and beeps and corrupted sounds feel like they are communicating a sense of internal brokenness that kind of gets more and more intense and real as these songs go on. It's almost like this is an album written by the saddest little android on the planet, essentially trying to understand how better to be a human being. I don't know. I'm just riffing at this point, but yeah. What do you think?
The whole album really is kind of reminiscent of Radiohead in a lot of ways. I think in a lot of how they deal with atmospherics is very comparable to something like in Rainbows, but here it's a lot more static and cold and occasionally industrial, like you said. A lot of the things that sort of create this album's identity to me are those sort of ephemeral washes of sound on the edges of a lot of the mixes here, which are, they're not even like full, complete sort of motifs or identifiable musical ideas, but they decorate this album with so much sort of sonic texture that I think that that's a lot of the reason as to why I've latched onto this as strongly as I have, is that it's one of the most unique sounding because of this, and it's just subtle enough to keep sort of saying, like, staying in step with the National as a band, but enough to like make it really stand out and feel distinct, and sort of the interplay that that has with the more organic parts really sort of musically emphasize the sort of narrative disruption that is sort of happening in all of these songs. And I think that Guilty Party is probably one of the best examples of that. I think one of the best like little ideas on here is the sort of, you can kind of hear the little tiny sort of plucked, is it a guitar? Is it a harp? I don't fucking know. It's a string instrument. And then it just sort of like progresses very, very slowly until the sort of instrumental break where it just sort of picks into its own kind of melody. And that one simple breakaway into this very, very sparse idea where the rest of the song is still kind of happening around it. It's sort of like he's just dissolved and collapsed at this point into just an absolute like mess, just like running down the process of what has kind of destroyed his marriage up until this point. And the way he actually puts it, the "you're sleeping night and day, how do you do it? Me, I'm wide awake, feeling defeated." And then the chorus is the "I say your name, I say I'm sorry, I know it's not working, I'm no holiday, it's nobody's fault, no guilty party, we just got nothing left to say." And then the part where he talks about the like another year getting away, another summer of love, I don't know why I care. That part always gets me just because it manages to sort of emphasize and push along the sort of passing of time, of just how this sort of thing that's eating away at their relationship and eating away at the both of them as individuals just absolutely dissolves them and corrodes them over the years, and just kind of leaves them feeling so defeated that they feel powerless to fight back against it. And I feel like that's really, it really does kind of feel like the opposite of the opener in a whole lot of ways. And I feel like the sort of ethos of both songs is very much similar in how they contrast Matt's sort of very quiet vocals with these very instrumentally busy but not necessarily loud songs, because I feel like Nobody Else Will Be There also sort of contains a lot of the same like atmospheric ideas. And then what's cool about that song to me is that it makes like, if you go back to the opening track, if it really makes like whenever like a small change structurally happens in that song, like my favorite moment, which is like the lead in to the final third of the song, where Matt just does the "hey baby," and then the descending strings just kind of engulf you, and it's like, it's really not that loud, it's really not that big of an idea, but when you hear it, it feels like you're listening to like the Nick Cave and Warren Ellis album Carnage, like the opener on that, when it does the it makes you feel that like emotionally, and it just sort of drags you. And when you combine that with the fact that Nobody Else Will Be There contains like, this is just a quintessential National song for me, because it contains everything that you could possibly want in a National song. And that, you know, you have the references to things like New York and whatnot. And I feel like this too it is a sort of emphatic declaration of the emotional dependency and wanting to sort of get away from that sort of the prying eyes of the outside world. And it is sort of a necessity, but there is an intimacy there of just, you know, wanting to share a drink to get away from your partner, these really elemental ideas of just wanting to escape and having this one person. And it feels a little bit untainted by sort of the pervading darkness of the rest of the album and the rest of this band's ideas when it comes to this sort of world. I feel like even on the most emotionally honest songs on their earlier records, it still sort of feels like they don't really get past the initial like disconnect of the relationship. There's such a wall in between the two people that Matt writes about, that it feels like it's just sort of innate. But here, Sleep Well Beast understands that, like, in order to build a sort of conceptual narrative around these people, you have to infrequently connect them so that when you break them, it remains all the more effective. And I feel like that's sort of what songs like Guilty Party and songs like Nobody Else Will Be There do musically, is that they connect and congeal ideas only to sort of break them apart there at the end, no matter how subtle. And it just sort of feels like everything instrumentally, no matter how erratic or different for the band, no matter how many cool electronic ideas it utilizes, they're so in lockstep with what they're doing conceptually that it just makes everything feel so much more effective on songs like this. It's why songs like Nobody Else Will Be There and Guilty Party are, in my humble opinion, fucking perfect.
I mean, I completely agree. I was just thinking as well, when you were reciting lyrics from Guilty Party, like just the cadence of the lyrics, you know, the hopelessness and brokenness of them, the way they kind of talk about a relationship that's sort of already kind of dead. I mean, Matt said that it's like he and Corinne wrote this song, like fantasizing or like imagining what it would be like, you know, at the end. You know, essentially it was a therapeutic way of kind of dealing with it.
That's got to be a hell of a relationship to be able to do that. Like, I can't even, it's just like, hey, let's hypothetically break our own marriage.
Well, I look, it works for them, you know what I mean? And I think it's telling as
No,
well
respect.
that if you look at the album cover, which depicts
Yeah.
Long Pond Studios, which is the studio that Aaron built and is the first, so this album was recorded there. It was the first National album to be recorded there. And you can see in the window, like the most prominent figure is actually Corinne herself, you know, at the front, and in front of the band, kind of surveying them as they record the record. And that's kind of quite a telling image, I think. But anyway, as I was saying, yeah, the cadence of the lyrics in Guilty Party, like so the song so much reminds me of About Today, which is kind of like their most classic breakup song, and has a similar approach where it's like like the lyrics are just like each line is like only a few syllables long, and it's just so kind of static the entire time and just so like lifeless. You know, it's a technique that Tom York adopts on one of my favorite songs of his, which is Dawn Chorus as well. He sings in that same sort of monotone way that somehow in its emotionlessness only makes you feel a million times more emotional. This is a record truly is a land of contrast. Like for all the ways in which it could be accurately described as this kind of nocturnal, sort of moodier record, you still get these incredible moments of like bombast that really do contrast powerfully with the more intimate Spear moments. I mean, let's talk about Day I Die, for instance, which is...
I mean, that's the only reason I didn't bring up the drumming yet, is because I feel like until like this moment, at least all like linearly on the track list, you begin this song with this sort of really bright, pretty sounding synth tone, and you're just like, oh wow, that's gorgeous. And then it just gets broken up by the sickest fucking drum fill ever. Like, goddamn,
it's so good. Just the way he's fucking hammering those toms or whatever he's doing, like just the bass drums that he's hitting to really pull you into that song. And either way, that's contrasted by that fucking guitar line, which sounds like it's literally on fire. Like it's just this lightning.
It sounds like
sound.
it's screaming. It's just like in agony as it's being played.
Yeah, and it's great because like in a way that's so fitting for a lot of the musical compositional ideas on this record, which are like really simple and really minimal, usually just one or two notes strung together and played over and over. But it's the texture and it's the performance and it's the style of play, particularly I'm talking about with the guitars, that makes them stand out. Like we've kind of talked about with High Violet and Trouble Will Find Me, how Bryce has kind of really established this guitar tone, that pattern that he typically has, where it's like these really wiggly, simplistic sounds that are like very sharp and very fast and very repetitive, essentially. And this basic guitar hook in this song is essentially another example of that, but it's stretched out a little bit. It's really put center stage. It really feels cathartic, even in and of itself, before the song even develops into what it becomes. It instantly feels like this cathartic thing. I mean, the song itself, like, ostensibly confronting, like, death is right there in the title, and it is ostensibly a song about thinking about, like, what have we established? What has our relationship been worth up to this point? And what will it mean when we're dead, essentially? Like, where will we be literally at that time when it's all over? And at that point, when we look back, how will we feel? And I mean, the verses here are some of the most like raw from Matt. I mean, we've talked about lyrical minimalism up to this point, but there's lots and lots of songs on this record where Matt will just kind of pack loads of information into his lines, and sometimes let them go on way too long as well. And it almost feels as though it's like controlled unraveling, in a certain sense. Like, the lines don't have the cadences and the overall sort of like, perfect construction that you would necessarily expect them to. Sometimes they run on too long. I don't need you. Besides, I barely ever see you anymore. And when I do, it feels like you're only halfway there. Like, he just does these things with the rhythm that he's and singing with that feels so disarming and unconventional. Like, and lines will just bleed into another one. Young mothers love me, even ghosts of girlfriend. He does that kind of poetic thing, like that poetic verse thing, where it's kind of like, in terms of meter, like the end of the line is not the end of the phrase, but it's just because of the way that the meter is established, the line has to end mid-sentence. Even ghosts of girlfriends call from Cleveland, they will beat me. And it's just this thing where each line kind of finishes halfway through the line that's being said, and then the first half of the line gets said, and then we get a new line in terms of, the cadence of the song. And so, like, it creates this, lyrically and musically, it creates this feeling of like rambling in the way that Matt sings. Like, every line is kind of just falling into the next, and they're not neatly sectioned in the way that they typically would be. I really love the way he does this in the second verse as well, like where he's like, I really don't have the courage not to turn the volume up inside my ears. For years I used to put my head inside the speakers in the hallway when you get too high and talk forever. It's this like almost fucking Cormac McCarthy thing of just like sentence after sentence, and they're not separated.
God, that's what it reminds me
going
of.
on and on and on and on and on. And I love that. I think Matt's so skilled at doing that. And it's something that could, in the hands of a lesser songwriter, be an absolute fucking clusterfuck. But you're never, ever left adrift or unable to understand innately what Matt is trying to communicate. And it also really feels like it fits in with this idea of the drunken, kind of the person who relies so much on wine and vodka in this song, and gin on the first song, and it's always a different spirit that they're just completely reliant on to get them through these situations. You even get that sense when he's like, my great uncle, I get a little punchy with the vodka, just like my great uncle Valentine Jester did when he had to deal with those people like you who made no goddamn common sense. You get this real sense of someone like ugly, or at least like unfiltered, coming out through the alcohol. And also, I just want to say, while I'm rambling in a very Matt-like fashion, but there's this moment about midway through the song where it all kind of falls away and the guitar takes center stage, and you get, again, this sort of, it is a solo, but it's an unconventional one. And it's just the tone of it. Like, it's actually just before he comes in with the third verse about getting punchy with the vodka, the guitar tone while he's singing that is like, it's one of my favorite guitar tones. It might be my favorite guitar tone ever. It's just this really do 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 do, and as it goes on, it just sounds like you're being swallowed up into it, and it's just the most gorgeous thing I've ever fucking heard. Like, and every single time that guitar does that do 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 do, you can hear the edges on it getting harsher, and it just kind of gets more and more intense. And the way Matt's lyrics, kind of his delivery speeds up as well as that gets more intense, and it just kind of careens into that come outside and leave with me car crash ending that just goes back into the main refrain. Like, that to me is one of the most awe-inspiring moments of musical like construction or whatever that the National have ever done. Like I adore this song. It's legitimately, I have to update my list, but for a long time it has been one of my top 10 favorite National songs, just because musically I completely, my jaw drops every time I listen to it, and I've heard it over 100 times.
Completely agree, honestly. I feel like, again, just like the album is a land of contrast, sequencing this right after the opener is sort of a stroke of genius, because that's a very plaintive, and even like at its most explosive moments, it's still just kind of an iteration of the first idea that it presents, sort of melodically or structurally, whereas this is just in a constant state of perpetual motion. And that sort of, the evolving guitar tones, just the drums, everything about it, it's so invigorating, and it's there to contrast the first moment, but it's also there to contrast within itself, and it's beautiful. And one of the coolest things about the way this is written to me is that it's like, when he's asking on the chorus, he said, the day I die, where will we be? And I feel like that's sort of a dual question. He's sort of asking in that first like verse, he relaying the struggles of being a DILF, I guess. He's like, I don't need you. I don't need you. I barely see you anymore. And when I do, it feels like you're only halfway there. Young mothers love me. Even ghosts of girlfriends call from Cleveland. They'll meet me anytime and anywhere. So he has a world of people, or at least in his head he does, of people who are, emotionally and sexually receptive to him, but that he chooses not to engage with because he is so involved in this. And I feel like that's an interesting way of sort of letting the listener know of, like, that sort of traditional Matt Berninger main character sleaziness, but also sort of like he's still emotionally relatable, and that, like, again, he's sort of refusing to engage with that world, but he's also enough of a bit of a dirtbag to acknowledge that it's there in the first place. But the thing about it is that he's like wondering, he's like, all of these people are receptive to me. Why aren't you? We're not connected anymore. I want us to have this connection. And he's asking, like, the day I die, where will we be? He's not just asking we as in our relationship. He's like, are you even going to be with me when I die? Because we are so disconnected. And that's just such a fucking heartbreaking sentiment to immediately follow the stark intimacy of the first track. You just have him being like, are we even going to die together? Just like that very plain question. It's so supremely powerful. The world of differences this album hits you on the first two tracks alone. It feels like you've been on a journey with these two people.
Yeah. And I mean, then it goes into what I think is like, there's a lot of deep cuts on this record that I just think are genuinely some of the most underrated National songs. And Walk It Back is one of them. This song had quite a journey in getting to where it is on the record. And of all the songs on this album, this is the one that I think has transformed the most in its various live iterations and then to what it is now. So it used to be called Checking Out of a Collapsing Space, and then it was renamed Roman Candle. And now it's Walk It Back. And so this song used to be much more guitar heavy, and it's kind of transmogrified into something that is very heavily electronic. And it has this kind of moodiness to it that's much more befitting of the quieter moments that we've already talked about. But I just love the melodic, the vocal melodies on this song. I love the way that the chorus goes, I only take up a little of the collapse in space, and the way that that is matched by these kind of very beautiful twinkly guitar tones that eventually kind of take over once the vocals fall away, and just kind of have this little interactive thing that they're doing with the bass and drums, where they're almost dancing together. Like, it has this feeling of movement in the space. And then it has one of the most unusual sections of any National song, which is a sample of a quote that supposedly originally came from Karl Rove, who I believe was I want to say, like, Secretary of Defense or something like that in the Bush administration. He was a really high-ranking figure anyway, who has very intimately involved in the no, he was the he was the senior advisor and deputy chief of staff, and he was very involved in the Iraq War in the 2000s. And the quote comes from a piece by the political journalist Ron Suskind. And there's a really interesting story behind this quote. It's quite a famous quote, actually, sort of talking about how America essentially establishes its empire and perpetuates it, essentially, in terms of being a kind of a force that, like a puppet master almost, just holds the strings of world politics, essentially. And in the context of the song, when this comes in, it's quite disarming, essentially, because up to this point, like it's seemingly been a song about, just individual introverted awkwardness, essentially, like trying to wish you could shrink yourself down and be completely invisible in a space. But it also has this lyrical approach that echoes like a political gaffe, essentially, that idea of walking it back, when a politician says something that they then end up having to go back on or contradict, essentially, the idea of walking it back. And this is maybe the first moment on the record where Matt draws a direct parallel between, like, personal individual awkwardness in a social or relationship sense and actual political language. And so then to have that refrain of, "I better walk it back," go into this quote that's essentially, a bald-faced admission of American supremacy and the fact that the American government has the power, essentially, to dictate reality itself. Essentially, we will create realities. It is kind of like, it's kind of a joke almost, this idea that, like, this quote is something that's so just bald-faced that it could never be walked back, essentially. But what's funny about it is that people kind of forget about it a little bit, and they forget a little bit about who Karl Rove is. And there's this really interesting and hilarious story in terms of this song, where like some reporter, I think Newsweek, played this song to Karl Rove and asked him about the quote, essentially. And Karl Rove said that the quote itself was completely fictitious. It was made up by a journalist, the kind of shit that he would say. And then they played him the song, and this is what he said about it. The song starts with a Euro tech pop thing and transitions into a more peppy tune that's easier to dance to, and has a soundtrack that on YouTube is impossible to hear. I suspect it won't make Casey Kasem's top 40. Which is just...
How long has Casey Kasem even been dead? Like...
and then, like,
Jesus
Matt
Berninger,
like, he kind of responded to this by saying that, like, we should give Karl Rove a share of the royalties for the song. But it's funny that he's not asking, only Ron Suskind is. So we're going to give Ron Suskind a piece of Walk It Back and lend up a couple $100 in 20 years. But I want to ask that Ron Suskind shares it with Karl Rove. I'd love Karl Rove to see that check, just to remind him we know he said that. And then essentially, the National's own Twitter account basically quote tweeted an article reporting on Karl Rove's opinion about the song that simply said, "Fuck you, Karl." That was just a really funny little bit of, like,
referring to anything on this album as a Euro tech pop thing is...
it's such a funny insight into someone who's clearly not listened to any music since the mid-90s. Like,
no, Jesus Christ.
Like it's like comparing the National to Eiffel 65. It's just really funny.
Yeah.
But anyway, like, this song has that little strange midsection, and then it goes into, like, it's gorgeous outro with these amazing muted pianos that just has this really insistent melody. It's actually one of my favorite little melodies on the album, low-key.
Yeah.
And if you listen to them play it live, it's not muted at all. That piano in the last part of the song is, like, a really loud, and it feels really epic, actually. And it's a real transformation, because when you hear it on the album, it's, like, barely audible, and it's just kind of simmering there as Matt essentially depicts stumbling through the streets, his own body and his arms, trying not to collapse and trying to find his way home, and almost describing his lover or his partner as a lighthouse, essentially, that he's reliant on to anchor and direct himself. And it really has, this whole song has the feel of, like, of a drunken night that just gets more and more disorienting as it goes on. Essentially, this person who is making a complete embarrassment of themselves and just ending up completely alone in the middle of the street, staring up at neon lights that look like stars. And it's just this really eerie and beautiful and strange track as well. It goes on for quite a while, which is like, it's not the only song that does that, because it should be remarked as well, up until this point anyway, the longest National album. It's funny, like, I think from Boxer onwards, I want to say each National album is longer than the one before it, and it's funny how that's been the case consistently. And they've just kind of let more and more ideas just sort of pour onto these albums. Like, along with probably the other big standouts in terms of being stranger, eerier moments on the record, where these musical ideas are a little bit more pared back and unusual. I also think of songs like Empire, Line, and of course the title track as well. I mean, what do you think, Jake, of these moments on the record that are a little bit more sort of eerie and just kind of very different to what we would expect from the National typically?
They are certainly different, and they are certainly, not as immediate, and that is what led to me having such a journey with this album. I think is that even by the National standards, this is not an immediate record, and because it is on the longer side, even though it doesn't quite eclipse an hour, I still think it's very well paced for what it is. It's still an album that you need to sit with, live with, interrogate, because again, even it makes Alligator seem like Ace of Spades. Like, it's just not something that's going to hit you with the immediacy that you're used to this hitting with, because it's an album that, like you said, that this album has lots of underrated National songs. In my opinion, this is an album that comprises of nothing but underrated National songs. It's just track after track after track after track of some of their best stuff that doesn't get quite maybe acknowledged for what it is. And I understand that. I mean, like, even if you don't live with it, but like with most records that I think most people go on journeys with, it means that once you finally get at where you arrive with the record, it makes it all the more satisfying. Because yeah, there are moments like Walk It Back that I was at first initially just kind of like, well, this is kind of minimal and nice, and I like the sentiment, but it's just not as musically compelling as the rest of the record or other National songs or whatever. But it not only does it grow on you individually, but as a piece of the greater whole, I feel like everything on this album, more than any other National album, is sort of elevated by what surrounds it. It's a really dynamic listening experience if you really lend yourself to it. But there are moments that sort of pick up the pace that are a little bit more fun. Turtleneck, for example, I think is kind of a really fun, underrated banger of a song that I still really enjoy.
Turtleneck is so fucking underrated. The thing about Turtleneck is that there's like a contingent of National fans that fucking hate this song. And look, and to be fair, there's a contingent that love it as well. Like, it's a very divisive song. I've always loved Turtleneck, and I always kind of fucking ride for it, because it feels like it gets a little bit shat on for, some of it's again, the lyricism here and just the delivery is so, like, just ridiculously tasteless. And it's like, and also, like, Matt has described this song as like a physical reaction to the election of Trump as well. So it's like, he talks about, pissing fits, crying on our doorsteps, poor leaving their cell phones in the bathrooms of the rich. And when they try to turn them off, everything they switch to is another man in shitty suits everybody's cheering for. Like, it's very just blunt, this song. And it's like, so like, it's almost
leave the weed by the bed.
It's a little bit embarrassing, but like in a way that, because of how fucking raw this shit is, and listen, that solo is just pure fucking noise, essentially, in the midsection of the song. It's just sheer, like, all that Bryce is doing is just basically attacking his guitar. He's like deliberately just playing these really bent and twisted and fucked up notes. It's one of the weirdest guitar solos.
No wave album.
Like, and it's just such a fucking, those drums, and there's that continual that fucking energy here is just so fucking unique for this band. And it's just like such a like this album is full of moments that just completely blindside you, especially if you're approaching this being familiar with the National's earlier records. And that's a quality I love so much about this record, is that, yeah, the blindsiding moments are very unique and strange and different and full of musical ideas that maybe do clash in certain ways. Like, we haven't even talked about one of my absolute favorite songs on this record, which is I'll Still Destroy You, which is just
Oh,
almost entirely bizarre musical ideas that kind of clash together and shouldn't really work as well as they do. But that song is like, it's like an electro disco rock opus about being a fucking deadbeat, disconnected father who's constantly touring and feels as though every time he comes home, his kids and his partner are complete strangers that nevertheless his absence is going to completely destroy. This is a really despondent song. Like, the bridge here, I have no possessions, no point of view or vision. I'm just trying to stay in touch with anything I'm still in touch with. Like, and there's moments here where he describes like ambling around trying to find a lighter, essentially depicting this encounters with his kids where he's just basically off his fucking face. And I'm sure this is fictionalized again. Like, what Matt does is he
yeah.
essentially takes his, worst attributes and his worst moments, and he kind of creates drama out of them and turns them into, or fictionalizes them. But still, it's rough. Like, it is really, really rough. And moments like this really just break you in terms of how bitterly ugly they are. And that's one aspect of this record that I think it's the beast and Sleep Well Beast. It is the ugliness that the record confronts, both in terms of the world that, there's a middle-aged guy who's increasingly disconnected from everything around him lives in, but also how he feels internally and how he is able or unable to relate to himself as much as the people around him. It's just, yeah, it's haunting.
Yeah, I Still Destroy You. I'm not sure if it's on specific songs or if it's on like most songs on here, but Justin Vernon has some credits on this album. And I feel like I Still Destroy You is probably where you can feel his presence, or at least his impression, the most, as this really does feel kind of like Bon Iver, like instrumentally, like specifically the kind of like weird avant-garde electronic shit that he would do on like his last two albums. And I feel like that influence kind of overrides a lot of this record, honestly, like just in the ways that it uses some of its like weirder timbral textures. I can see the through line there, but and I love just like on I'll Still Destroy You. It's, to me, it's seeding the sort of helplessness to the sort of inevitability of the damage that you'll cause. Like, it's a song that's about not only like reckoning with the fact that you're going to hurt people that are close to you, but like basically just laying down and accepting the fact that you're helpless to stop the inevitability that is. And that is like a really powerful, really devastating idea, because like this is one of the National albums that feels like, again, those sort of earlier records, it feels like everything is sort of set in stone. It feels like everything is sort of unchanging, and it's sort of like all of the regret and all of the pondering is on things that are forever going to be set in their ways. Whereas Sleep Well Beast, to me, feels like it's the album that has the most push and pull, that its protagonist maybe has the most sway, but still, like, you still feel that he's maybe trying in some instances to be a better person, to make his relationships better, but he just consistently either fails or just inevitably gives up to the enormity of the world around him. And it's sort of, you sort of feel that struggle the most on an album like this. And it's sort of where, like, I'll Still Destroy You, I feel like, is a sort of turning point for the record as a whole, where it's kind of an acceptance of that. And then the following songs are kind of like a sort of the final third of the album entirely comprises of just sort of wallowing and sort of reveling in that. And I think that like once the sort of struggle of the first 2/3 kind of ends, that sort of palpable acceptance just makes listening to this feel so fucking raw.
Yeah, I mean, I'll Still Destroy You and Guilty Party together are kind of like the lowest moments of this record, like the kind of real reckoning with the despondent, total disconnect that you've been left in. But the rest of the record after that is kind of like, okay, that's the lowest essentially that I've been. What now? Which is a great thing about the arc of this record is that, yeah, it takes you to the lowest and most kind of haunting and alienating points of disconnection from the people you love and from the world that you're immersed in. But it ends with a string of songs, the last 3 songs on this record specifically, that feel like a step forward in a certain sense, you know, or feel like at least cushioning the blow of
underrated songs.
Cushioning the blow of that brutality, I think. I mean, Corinne at the Liquor Store is definitely worth shouting out. One of the more like, you know, straightforward national songs, more or less. I mean, it has a piano melody that's very reminiscent of the Pink Rabbits one, but it almost has this resonance to it that makes it feel very different to that song, because whereas that song is a very like just heartbroken song, this one has a little bit more of like acceptance in it. And it's worth noting as well that like one of the part of the motivation behind naming this song what it was that because of the song Karen on Alligator, ever since then people have consistently mispronounced the name of Corinne Besser essentially and always called her Karen. And so Matt deliberately called the song Corinne at the Liquor Store and referenced that in his lyrics so that to correct that record. And he has this great quote where he talks about and does a very Jake Core comparison here. He compares his process with Corinne as writer with, of course, the process of the other great songwriting married couple that instantly comes to mind, Tom Waits and Kathleen Brennan. And he references a quote that Tom Waits says about their writing process, which is that she washes, I dry, which is just very Tom Waits way of describing their collaborative process. And Matt says, well, our version of this is I spill, I get the stain all over the clothes, then I put it in the washer. Corinne goes through it all, dries it, irons it, and folds it. She's an editor and writer herself, and I really mean it when I say a lot of the best ideas are hers. So there is this sense in which their collaborative process is almost like this mess that Matt makes because that is what he has to do essentially in order to process. And then it is this mess that she cleans up essentially because that is what gives her purpose. And it's not, and I guess you could read that cynically as a kind of like, you know, a playing out of a typical heteronormative relationship role, but it seems to be a thing that's generally therapeutic for both of them. And it is a process that they're both so intimately intermingled within as well. And this is like, you know, fittingly, though it's a more tasteful song in terms of construction, it has fewer of the, you know, weird esoteric elements thrown into it that other songs do. You still have Matt ambling. He has this lyric about finding dead John Cheever. That's like a great example of like random lines that just completely do not, in terms of cadence and construction, like work.
I had to look up what this lyric was to understand who this was and the reference he was making, because I absolutely heard this as dead John Cheadle or Don Cheadle every time I heard this fucking album. Because he's kind of mumbling and you can't really hear him, and he's like, the way I'm dead John Cheadle.
It's this bizarre lyric because like John Cheever, famous like American mid-20th century novelist who was like famously a closeted gay, a writer essentially, and the lyric is I think about like I guess Matt putting himself in the perspective of someone who discovers, I guess, the dirty laundry of some like famous artistic figure essentially, and has to kind of reckon with that information. It's very difficult to interpret. It's very bizarre. It feels very Matt Berninger. And then, but it all kind of like just resolves itself into this admission and acceptance of the fact that you sometimes need to just take the blame. You sometimes need to just accept the mess essentially that you have made, and that whatever the result of that is always a foregone conclusion. So it's pointless in fighting it. And that makes it quite a powerful song, I think. And it goes into what is, again, another one of my absolute favorite National songs, Dark Side of the Gym.
Yes.
I mean, this is like Worth noting as well, as just about anyone will tell you when talking about the song, the title is a reference to a gymnasium, not a gym itself. It's a song that it's a reference to a Leonard Cohen lyric. And the idea is like, it's a gymnasium that is the setting for a dance, essentially, whether it's like a prom dance or whether it's like some other kind of setting. And the song itself is like a kind of shuffling waltz, I think. I'm no expert in dance itself, but I'm pretty sure it's a waltz. And it has this boom, 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 this kind of shuffle to it rhythmically. And it has this tone to it as well that makes it feel like a kind of end of the night sort of like last dance sort of song. It has these almost like Mazzy Star-esque guitar tones like fade into you. It reminds me of a little bit. These sort of bowed, bent sort of guitar sounds that match these warm synthesizer tones that I absolutely love. And the story that feels like after this, falling apart in an ultimate acceptance of a catastrophic mess, essentially, that you're bound towards, it's almost like flashing back, essentially, to a simpler time. It's the flashback. It's the moment at the climax of the story where suddenly we're cast back into something deep in the past to give us some additional context, or to take us out of the climax for a little bit before we return to it. And it is, and structurally, it coming at this point in time makes it so much more powerful. We've had all these songs about disconnection and alienation and falling apart in this relationship, and all of a sudden we're cast back to like a slow show era time, a simple time where it was like, pining for someone and that initial seeds of connection. There's this kind of delightfully twisted sense of humor in the line, "I'm going to keep you in love with me for a while," which almost like suggests this willful, admission of the fact that I am the source of the friction and the ultimate end of the connection that we foster. But there's also like these frequent references to like being speechless as well, being unable to even communicate in these moments what you're feeling and how you're processing it. And it's really, really beautiful. It's like one of the most beautiful National songs. And it has this fucking key change halfway through that is like one of the most, like, you don't often get key changes in National songs, but when you do, here is maybe the most like bold of them all. It goes from this very sort of eerie but soothing kind of minor key ballad, and all of a sudden it kind of just switches into this major key thing in the second half, and it's like drifting upwards as he kind of fantasizes about these like kind of ancient Greek mythic castrati figures that are like kind of carrying them away. And it's a really stunning way for the song to progress and build and ultimately fracture apart into that broken electronic noise that makes it feel like a memory that's stuttering out of existence or a file that's being deleted. Musically, this song is one of the most amazing and fascinating on the entire album, I think.
It's one where the sort of organic and electronic moments don't clash, they just purely congeal. The sort of synths, the strings, the drums, they all feel like they're totally at peace with one another. It's just sort of drifting around this sort of sea of sound, and it's gorgeous. I love the repeated refrain of "I'm going to keep you in love with me for a while," because it does sort of allude to that sort of acceptance of responsibility that sort of comes from those last couple of songs. But it's also like, it could be a lyric that informs both the sort of past and the future. It's sort of informing the past in the sense that's like, he's going to be the one that's going to keep them in love for a while, or the sense of like everything that's, causing a disconnect for him in the present, he's going to willfully push past that and sort of preserve that. But it's still sort of like a, up to interpretation. It's sort of like these last two songs for me are less the answer to a question and more just the posing of a question of whether or not he is going to sort of not only own up to everything, but sort of push past the entire world that feels like it's simultaneously keeping them together and keeping them apart, and whether or not he's going to be able to sort of put that to the side and maintain and preserve their connection as people. And this is where their connection feels the most potent. It feels almost like a callback to the opening track, where to me, nobody else will be there always feels like, we makes a reference to a lyric in the stairwell. It feels like that's taking place after the dance that happens on Dark Side of the Gym, where, they're going to get a drink and get away from all of these people. And then at the very end, after you go through everything and see everything that informs these people's future, you cut back to the past at the very end at Dark Side of the Gym and see just what happens before that creates that tangible connection. And then you fast forward to the end with the title track, which I think is an absolutely beautiful structural choice.
And an absolutely beautiful song as well. I mean,
Yes.
it's funny how like so many of the musical motifs of this entire album kind of just all get a reprisal here. Like you have that skittering kind of drum machine thing that's previously happened on like a number of other songs, like Guilty Party.
Choral vocals that are like,
you get the choral vocals, you get this idea of the loping piano motif that we've had throughout this record on very many songs. And this one is particularly lovely because it's just like a straightforward downward progression. Boom, 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 boom. It's very, very simple. There's absolutely nothing complex about it, but it creates this kind of sense of swelling and kind of sort of spiraling and kind of movement, essentially, that allows the whole thing to have this ambling quality. And I mean, this is probably the most formless song on the record, so I understand why a lot of people aren't really drawn to it. And it's really a song that only works. It doesn't really work outside of the context of the album, but in the context of the record, as a structural finale to this record, and of course as a mirroring musically of the opening of the album, which also has an ambling piano melody and sort of drum machine sound to it. This is a fantastic finale. This is actually my favorite song lyrically on this entire album. I think this is some of Matt's most powerful lyricism. We've been stuck out here in the hallway for way, way too long. I'm at a loss, I'm losing grip, the fabric's ripped. That line feels like it kind of echoes the ripping and tearing electronic sounds all over this record, but particularly present here. Go back to sleep, let me drive, let me think, let me figure it out. How to get us back to the place we were when we first went out. So that last line almost references the very last song as well. That kind of flashback, being stuck out here in the hallway, as you said, kind of references back to Nobody Else Will Be There. Go back to sleep, let me drive, references back to Empire Line, which similarly has this idea of like of movement forward and driving and kind of essentially being in the back seat while some kind of transit is happening. I'll tell you about it sometime, the time we left, that choral refrain sounding so monotone and simple and sleepy. Losing parents, losing sense, I don't know what we should do. I think that's an oblique reference to the fact that while this album was being recorded, Aaron's mother-in-law passed away from cancer, and it's actually dedicated to her as well. So that was something that influenced the tone of the album and the process of recording it in some ways as well. Became a father when I was still a son. She brings it out in you. That's a nice line because the first half of it is like, it's Matt kind of reflecting on his own identity as a father. And then she brings it out in you is almost like Corinne responding to that first half of it, of like, reflecting on how their daughter essentially brings the fatherhood out of him. See you at the end of your party with your wild white eyes and filling up the teacup with gin in your secret postcard life. That line really reminds me of Wasp Nest from Cherry Tree, which has a similar like, your eyes are broken bottles, and there's a reference to alcohol in that song as well. Like, and then there's the third verse, which is the most kind of densely packed here, and is the one where I think that the political and sort of socio-cultural theme starts to kind of come full circle a little bit. We leave our saviors wrapped around the necks of new machines, a very obvious political lyric, or at the ends of threads that hold their bodies to the ground. And then the men who look a little like they feel like me offer them some bottled water, and then they cut them down. I could take a good amount of time to pick apart that lyric and everything that it's referring to, but I think it is quite clearly about the process, the cyclical process of political systems
I was
continually
about to say
iterating,
we just had a bit
iterating.
election in the United States, and I'm really feeling that lyric right now.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I came back to see if you were here, but everything was different. Your voice was low. You blended in. I could barely hear you speak. You were always my last second bright spot in the distance. Thought you were
Mm,
something good that I would always keep. That
God.
last second bright spot in the distance actually reminded me this morning of Hard to Find, the closing track on the last album, which does
Yeah.
reference that Great Gatsby reference of like the light across the water, essentially, that represents something that is hard to find, essentially. And here in this song, it's like almost a continuation of that idea, something that he can't, that where in the last album, it was something that was hard for him to find. Whereas here it's like he has found that thing and he can't keep it. He can't hold on to it. He's inevitably bound to destroying it in some ways, which he then references in the bridge that calls back to "I'll still destroy you," and this refrain of "sleep well, beast, you as well, beast," where it's either a final greeting between him and his partner, essentially, as they kind of end that cyclical day in, day out process that they're going through, or it's like it's a greeting to the machine, that he exists within, that idea that hopefully there will be some kind of peace while we wait for the next thing, or for the next stage of whatever this is to happen. And you have all of this situated in this massively impressionistic musical landscape, right? You just have
Mm-hmm.
so much noise and clutter. You have a guitar solo that is like even more kind of detuned and amusical than the one in Turtleneck. I mean, this one is like, it's just like, it feels like it's barely even it's like barely even a guitar solo. It's like the most just broken, cluttered, crushed up noises, essentially, that are being made with this guitar. I absolutely adore it. It sounds
Oh yeah.
so fundamentally unraveling in a way that makes you feel like, this tightly wound thing, this album that started so like clear in its identity, or like so simplistic and minimal in its musical ideas, has just gradually, as it's gone on, unfurled and unraveled more and more and more into this just mess of its constituent parts that are just splayed out across the landscape in front of you. Like, and you could draw a political analog there as well for how the world essentially shifted in the time this album was being written and recorded. But even then, even if you want to stick away from that and just focus on the personal, it does feel like, in many ways, if I were to sum this whole album up in one word, it would be that: unraveling.
Yeah, I think that this is the perfect way to end the album, as a sort of, again, it's something that leaves you in a state of not quite disrepair, but it definitely leaves the experience open to interpretation. There are times when I finish this album and feel like this is a resolution that implies some kind of hope, or a resolution that might double down on the sort of conceited helplessness that the album is often reveling in. It just sort of depends on the day. I feel like there's a real versatility to the thematic core here, where it feels like the journey it takes you on is really as much your own as it is the characters that are being written about. And just the way it manages to sort of seamlessly conclude that here with the formless musicality of it is, again, gorgeous in every way you said it was. And it ends this experience in exactly the way you want it to be. This feels like a closer that's sort of this unbound by musical convention. It feels like this is the National getting to flex every creative and interesting tendency that they've had over the years in one project that seamlessly blends both the political and the personal, nestled inside a conceptual framework that's not a full-blown concept, but still a framework that allows them to exercise their strengths, but still bind it to something that feels overall more cohesive than just, creating an album full of songs. It feels like it's the most conceptual National record, but also it doesn't feel like it's anchored by that whatsoever. And in that, I find it to be infinitely like compelling as a text in and of itself. It's the most emotionally compelling to me. It's the one with the sort of tightest narrative through line. It's the one with the most, musical dynamism to it. It has the biggest extremes in their catalog for me, up there with maybe Alligator, and it's full of these moments of songs that are just such left turns for this band, but are executed with a verve and a bravura that they just haven't quite had before. And they have these moments of lyrics and specific songs that are absolutely gutting. And just, after moving to my equivalent of the big city, this has been an album that has soundtracked many late night nocturnal drives through, metropolitan areas, and has been an essential sort of like coping mechanism album for me, to the point where I would certainly say that this is the experience that this band has provided that I value, appreciate, and just straight up love the most and find the most comfort in. It's the National album that makes me feel the most understood, both in a like macro and micro sense, and the both personal and political. It captures the sort of helplessness that you feel as a sort of modern citizen of the world, but in a way that feels very personal and very intimate. And an album that it reminds me of, honestly, if we can harken back to our first retrospective, is this very much feels like their moon-shaped pool, an album that's very preoccupied with like internal neuroses and problems and helplessness, and a sort of macro world game-changing environmental sort of thing that's just sort of informing all of those neuroses. And it's sort of accented by the band synthesizing kind of every sound that they've accumulated over the years, but into this really melodic, really pretty, occasionally kind of formless blend of organic and electronic instrumentation. And I like that album and this album for many similar reasons, but it's the tight construction of this that really pulls it out ahead for me. And that makes it not just my favorite National album, but one of my 20 favorite albums ever.
Beautifully said. In fact, I couldn't have put it better myself. This is an album that ages like wine, to make a very fitting National simile there. It just gets better and better. It's an album that I think, because of the eclecticism of its soundtrack, its muted tone at certain points, the way that it progresses and the length of it was a little bit underrated, a little bit underestimated at the time, but has come to kind of be retroactively heralded more and more with the passage of time. Deservingly so, I think. I'm seeing more and more people who consider this up in the upper echelons of National Records. And I include myself in that category as well. I think this would be probably my third or fourth favorite National record. It's really hard to say. We'll reflect on that a little bit more at the end of the last episode, though. All right, let's do our favorite tracks and ratings for Sleep Well Beast. Jake, why don't you go first?
Oh, God. This is just one of those things where it's like every track is so inextricably linked to the other in my mind that it feels wrong. But yeah, favorite, definitely nobody else will be there. I'm gonna definitely stick up for Sleep Well Beast. It's like it's one of the lowest rated songs on the album, and just generally like one of the least talked about songs on here, but it's the one that I find the most comforting and the most beautiful. I just think it's such a wonderful resolution to the album, and it's a cradle of wonderful sound. So I'll say that, and I'll say Day I Die. That's that it's part of that opening 1-2 punch that's just so fucking incredible. Least favorite, I absolutely positively do not have one. This is an album of nothing but perfect and near perfect songs, and generally it favors the perfect ones. 10 out of 10, number one National album, baby.
Hell yes. Morgan has given this album a 9. Couldn't be with us, unfortunately. My 3 favorite tracks are I'll Still Destroy You, Dark Side of the Gym, and Guilty Party. I didn't even include Day I Die. Fuck, I don't fucking know what they are.
I mean, honestly, like, ask me again and I'll just be like, fucking Dark Side of the Gym, and fucking probably fucking System Dreams and Total Darkness, and I'll Still Destroy You. Fuck you. I don't know.
Bad endeavor. I can't do it. It's still a very good song. I won't take away from it, but the only thing that really holds us back from perfection for me is Born to Beg, which I think is just a little bit too staid for my tastes, but it's like its skin. It's still good. And I will give this album, I was just going to give it a 9, but I'm going to give it a 9.5, to be honest, because it's really, I think, a masterpiece, to be honest. And I think a record that rewards a very rich reading, I think, and it ages very
Yes.
well, and it gets better the more you think about it, as well as the more you listen to it. And it's just really all you could want from an album from the National at this point in their career, when they've already established themselves and have nothing left to do but challenge what they have established. All right, which gives us an average overall of 9.5 for the Nationals' Sleep Well Beast. Let us know at home what you think of this record. Where does it fit in your national ranking? What do you think of our discussion? Was there anything important that we missed out? Do you have a take that differs from ours? Do you agree with us? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this discussion, please remember to give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more, of course, if you haven't already done those things, but they do really, really help us, so we really appreciate it. If you want to go above and beyond and support us even more, you can hit the join button. And for just $1 a month, you can support us directly, become a member of the Jams and Tea family, get your name in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about on our main show, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. But until next time, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Hendrix, a most unusual gin.